Mom, you don't need to come. Daniel thinks it's better if it's just family. Claire said it softly, as if lowering her voice could soften the meaning. I stood beside my kitchen counter with one hand on the coffee pot. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Is that what you want too? I stayed still. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the small clock above my stove. Claire said Daniel had planned a private dinner and thought fewer people would make things easier. She told me not to take it personally. I said, "All right, Claire." I did not ask her to explain why her mother no longer counted as family. That evening taught me something I wish I had learned years earlier. A person can be generous for so long that everyone forgets generosity is a choice. They begin to treat it like a utility that should always be on. I did not know yet that one cancelled dinner would lead me to examine every door I had left unlocked. Before I tell you how that happened, tell me where you are listening from today. Maybe you are making breakfast, folding laundry, or sitting with a quiet cup of coffee. And tell me this too. Have you ever been made to feel like a guest in a family you spent your whole life helping to build? Be honest with yourself. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I was 68 that autumn. I had been a widow for 6 years, long enough to know the difference between loneliness and solitude. I lived outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the same modest brick house where Thomas and I had raised our daughter. I liked the life I had made there. The house was not impressive from the road. It had white trim, a narrow porch, and 2 maple trees that dropped more leaves than one woman could reasonably rake. Every October, the front walk disappeared under copper and gold. I swept it in the mornings anyway, because simple work gave shape to quiet days. Most mornings began before 7. I opened the kitchen blinds, filled the kettle, and ground enough coffee for 2 cups, even though I only drank 1. The second cup was an old habit from my marriage. Thomas had been gone 6 years, but some habits outlive grief because they are not really habits. They are forms of love. I had spent 34 years as an elementary school principal. That work taught me to recognize noise without being ruled by it. Angry parents, frightened children, exhausted teachers, budget meetings, and sudden emergencies had all trained me well. When people raised their voices, I usually lowered mine. It made listening easier. Retirement suited me better than I expected. I read the newspaper at the kitchen table. Twice a week, I volunteered at the local library and tended a narrow bed of herbs behind the garage. In colder months, I made soup on Sundays and froze half for later. My life was small by some standards, but it belonged completely to me. On the kitchen counter sat a wooden recipe box about the size of a loaf of bread. Thomas had made it during our first year of marriage, when neither of us could afford much beyond groceries and rent. The lid was slightly crooked. One corner had a dark burn mark from a skillet accident neither of us ever admitted causing. Inside were recipes, grocery notes, and cards written in Thomas's square handwriting. Some were practical. Some were ridiculous. One simply said, "Buy milk, call plumber, kiss Eleanor." I had kept everyone. Claire used to laugh when she was young and say the box looked older than the house, which was nearly true. I never thought of that box as valuable. No appraiser would have cared about it. No bank would have listed it beside an account balance. Still, if someone had asked what I would carry from the house during a fire, I would have taken that box before jewelry. Memory has its own system of accounting. Even then. Claire was my only child. She was 41 that year and had the same grey-green eyes Thomas had. When she worried, she rubbed her thumb against her index finger. As a girl, she had been tender-hearted. She brought injured birds home in shoeboxes and cried when flowers died after winter. She cared deeply. She had also always hated conflict. When she was 10, 2 friends argued over who would sit beside her at lunch. Claire solved it by eating alone in the library. At 16, she let a boyfriend choose her college application list because disagreeing felt worse than giving in. I worried about that softness, though I once called it kindness. Thomas saw the problem more clearly than I did. He used to say Claire could bend until she forgot her own shape. I would defend her and tell him she was simply considerate. He never argued. He only gave me that patient look husbands earn after decades of marriage. Years later, I understood what he had been trying to tell me. When Claire married Daniel Hayes, I told myself his certainty might balance her hesitation. Daniel always knew where he wanted to eat, which route to take, and what color a room should be. At first, that seemed useful. He made decisions quickly, and Claire appeared relieved. I mistook relief for happiness more than once. Their daughter Sophie was 14, and different from both of them. She watched before she spoke. She noticed when adults changed subjects too fast, and she asked direct questions that made everyone else reach for water. I loved that about her. Thomas would have loved it too, though he probably would have pretended to be offended. I saw Sophie most Saturdays when school and sports allowed it. We baked bread, worked crossword puzzles, and walked to the small farmers' market near the courthouse. She never treated my house like an old person's house. To her, it was simply Grandma's place, where cinnamon smelled stronger, and nobody checked a phone during lunch. That was why Claire's call unsettled me more than I first admitted. The dinner was not a casual meal. It was supposed to celebrate Daniel's parents' anniversary, and I had been included in similar gatherings for years. I had already bought a small gift. It sat wrapped in silver paper on the chair beside my front door. After we hung up, I left the gift where it was. I rinsed my coffee cup, wiped the counter, and opened the back door for a few minutes of cold air. The yard smelled of wet leaves and soil. Somewhere down the street, a rake scraped concrete. Ordinary sounds can be merciful when a sentence has made the room feel strange. I told myself not to dramatize it. Families have private dinners. Husbands and wives make plans. A mother does not need to be invited everywhere. All of that was reasonable, and I believed every word. What I could not explain was why Claire had sounded as though she was repeating a decision rather than making one. The phrase "just family" stayed with me through the afternoon. I heard it while sorting library donations and again while driving home past fields already cut for winter. It was not the exclusion itself that troubled me. It was the category. Daniel had found a simple phrase that placed me outside a circle I thought I had helped create. By 5, the sky had turned the pale grey that comes early in late October. I warmed tomato soup and cut a slice of bread. I ate at the kitchen table without turning on the television. Across from me, the empty chair looked no sadder than usual. Grief had taught me that silence is not always an accusation. After dinner, Sophie sent me a message asking whether I was feeling all right. She did not mention the anniversary dinner. I told her I was fine and asked about her history project. She replied with 3 sentences about the Civil War and 1 complaint about citations. I smiled because 14-year-olds can rescue an evening without knowing it. I did not ask Sophie what she had heard. Children should not be used as windows into adult conflicts. That was a rule Thomas and I had kept even when Claire was young. If something was wrong between adults, adults needed to speak for themselves, so I put my phone down and washed the soup bowl slowly. Later, I opened the recipe box and looked for Thomas's card for apple cake. I found it behind a stained recipe for chicken and dumplings. His handwriting brought back the sound of him humming off key near the sink. I rested my thumb on the card for a moment, then put it back exactly where it had been. I wish I could tell you I understood everything that night. I did not. I still believed the dinner was probably about Daniel being particular and Claire avoiding an argument. I still believed love could smooth most rough edges if everyone behaved patiently. Patience had served me well for 68 years. It had also hidden a few things. At 9:20, Claire called again. This time she sounded brighter, almost rehearsed. She said she hoped I understood and promised we could have lunch soon, just the 2 of us. I told her that would be nice. Then she asked, too casually, whether I had ever thought about simplifying the house now that I lived alone. I looked across the kitchen at the recipe box and the old clock. Beside them stood the narrow doorway Thomas had repainted 3 times before getting the trim right. Claire kept talking about stairs, upkeep, and how much easier a smaller place might be. I listened until she finished. Then I said, "I am comfortable where I am." When the call ended, I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the hallway. Nothing in my house had changed, yet something had shifted. I did not know about the trust questions, Daniel's business debt, or the papers that would later appear on a table. I only knew the peace in my home suddenly felt worth protecting. Thomas and I were never people who talked about sacrifice as if it deserved applause. We worked, paid what we owed, saved what we could, and tried not to make tomorrow somebody else's problem. Looking back, I can see how that ordinary discipline built something Claire later mistook for something that had simply appeared. Thomas taught high school science for most of his career, and I spent my days in elementary education. Neither salary impressed anyone at a dinner party. We learned to stretch $1 because there was no other sensible choice. We packed lunches, drove cars until repairs became foolish, and treated debt like a guest who had stayed too long. When Claire was small, Thomas kept a yellow legal pad in the kitchen drawer. Every Sunday evening, he wrote down the week's expenses in his square handwriting. Groceries, gas, piano lessons, property taxes. If we spent less than planned, he drew a tiny star beside the number. Those stars became a private celebration between us. We bought our brick house when Claire was 3. The mortgage frightened me more than I admitted. Thomas walked through every room on closing day and touched the walls as if he were introducing himself. He said, "We will make it ours slowly." That was exactly what we did, one repaired hinge and painted room at a time. The doorway between the kitchen and hallway still carried 3 faint pencil marks from Claire's childhood. Thomas measured her every birthday until she complained she was too old. I never painted over them. To a stranger, they were marks on wood. To me, they were years standing quietly in a row, asking nothing from anyone. There was a blue paint stain near the bottom of the stair rail from the summer Thomas insisted we could refinish it ourselves. We could not. The project took 3 weekends and 2 arguments. For years afterward, he would touch that stain and say it was proof that pride should always keep a professional's phone number nearby. When Claire started college, she received a partial scholarship, but there was still a large gap. Thomas and I covered it. We did not empty our retirement accounts or borrow against the house. We used savings we had built for years. Claire graduated without student debt, and I remember how relieved she looked in her cap and gown. 4 years later, when she needed help with the down payment on her first townhouse, we gave her $28,000. It was not a loan. Thomas wrote that plainly in the card we handed her. "Start your home without owing us for it." Claire cried, hugged us both, and promised she would never forget what it meant. When she married Daniel, we paid for the small reception she wanted at a restored inn outside town. We covered the flowers, the dinner, and the photographer. Daniel's parents paid for music and wine. Nobody kept score. At least I did not. I believed families became stronger when gifts were allowed to remain gifts. There were smaller things too. A transmission repair when Claire was 30. A dental bill after Sophie's braces cost more than expected. 2 months of preschool when Daniel changed jobs. None of those checks harmed us. Thomas and I had planned carefully, and helping our daughter gave us genuine pleasure when the need was real. What I did not understand then was how repetition changes expectations. The first time someone receives help, gratitude fills the room. The 5th time, relief arrives faster than gratitude. After enough years, the help can begin to feel like part of the furniture. Nobody remembers who carried it inside. They only notice when it moves. Thomas noticed that change before I did. Once, Claire called about an unexpected tax bill. After I hung up, Thomas asked whether she had requested money or simply assumed we would send it. I told him there was little difference. He shook his head and said, "There is all the difference in the world." I was irritated with him for saying it, Mothers are talented at defending their children from truths that sound unkind. I told him Claire was responsible and Daniel worked hard. Thomas agreed with both statements. Then he said, "Good people can still become comfortable with somebody else's generosity." I remembered that sentence years later. The rental property came almost by accident. A retired teacher we knew wanted to sell a small duplex and move closer to her son. Thomas had some savings from an inheritance, and we bought it after months of careful discussion. We managed it ourselves for years, replacing roofs, answering late calls, and learning more about plumbing than we wanted. It was never glamorous income. Rent arrived, then taxes arrived. A furnace failed in January. A water heater leaked through a ceiling. Still, the duplex slowly paid for itself. By the time Thomas retired, it had become one of the quiet financial pillars beneath our life. We rarely mentioned it to anyone, including Claire. After Thomas died, I kept the duplex for 2 more years. Managing tenants without him made the property feel heavier than it had before. I eventually sold it and invested the proceeds. Megan Roth helped me update my estate plan afterward. That was when the family trust became more important than a folder I rarely opened. The trust held investment accounts, part of the duplex proceeds, and other savings Thomas and I had accumulated. Its value moved with the market, but that autumn it stood near $860,000. I did not think of that number as wealth. I thought of it as years of work converted into choices I had not yet made. I was the trustee while I was alive and capable. The documents were clear. I could use my money, change beneficiaries, sell investments or revise instructions. Claire was meant to benefit later, and Sophie would be protected as well. Nothing about the trust gave anyone a present claim on my decisions. That mattered more than the amount. Thomas and I had never raised Claire by promising her an inheritance. We told her to build her own life and consider anything left behind a blessing, not a plan. She seemed to understand. For years she asked almost nothing about our accounts. She knew we were comfortable. She did not know the structure, balances, or exact details. Daniel knew even less. In the early years of their marriage, he showed no interest at all. He talked about work, home projects, and local football. If Thomas mentioned investments, Daniel changed the subject. I once thought that was refreshing. Money can make some family conversations unpleasant, and his lack of curiosity felt almost respectful. The year after Thomas died, Daniel helped me replace a loose porch board. I offered to pay him for the materials, and he laughed. "You are family," he said. "Stop trying to make everything a transaction." I remembered that kindly for a long time. It made his later questions harder to understand when they finally began. Grief also made me more generous for a while. I paid for a summer trip Claire wanted to take with Sophie. I told myself Thomas would have loved the photographs. Later, I covered part of a kitchen repair after a pipe burst. Giving made me feel useful during a season when usefulness was easier to carry than sorrow. Megan once asked whether I wanted those gifts documented as advances against Claire's eventual inheritance. I said no immediately. I did not want a ledger between my daughter and me. Megan nodded, but reminded me that clarity protects affection. I understood the legal point. Emotionally, I still wanted generosity to remain uncomplicated. That was my mistake, though not the mistake people might expect. Giving was not wrong. Helping Claire was not wrong. The danger was believing that love alone would preserve the meaning of every gift. Love cannot control the story another person tells themselves about what they deserve. Only boundaries can do that. On quiet afternoons, I sometimes reviewed the trust statement at the kitchen table, not because I feared running out of money, but because Thomas had taught me to know where things stood. I checked balances, filed correspondence, and placed everything back in the same drawer. The recipe box sat nearby, holding a different kind of accounting. The money represented choices we had postponed, vacations we did not take, cars we kept another year, raises we saved instead of spending. It also represented luck, steady employment, and a property that appreciated at the right time. I felt grateful for all of it. Gratitude, however, never required me to surrender control of it. That distinction sounds obvious when I say it now. At the time, I rarely needed to say it aloud. Claire had her household, I had mine. We loved each other across that boundary without discussing it. I assumed adulthood had made the line permanent. I did not realize how quickly financial pressure could make an old boundary look negotiable. A few days after the cancelled anniversary dinner, I found the silver-wrapped gift still sitting beside my front door. I carried it to the hall closet and placed it on the top shelf. I did not return it. I was not angry enough for gestures. I simply did not want to look at it every time I entered my own home. Then I made coffee in Thomas's old mug and sat beside the kitchen window. A cold wind pushed leaves across the yard in small circles. The house was quiet, but not empty. I thought about the life Thomas and I had built, and how carefully we had protected it from debt, panic, and unnecessary risk. That care still mattered. The clock above the stove clicked into the next minute. I looked at the recipe box, the trust drawer, and the faint blue stain on the stair rail beyond the kitchen. Everything around me had been built slowly. I did not know anyone was beginning to count it. I only knew I had spent a lifetime learning what things cost. 3 days after our second phone call, Claire asked if she and Daniel could stop by on Saturday afternoon. She said Sophie needed a book from my shelf for a school assignment. I told her, of course. Then I spent the morning making soup, sweeping the porch, and reminding myself that family visits should not feel like inspections. They arrived just after 2. Claire hugged me first, but Daniel stepped through the doorway before I finished taking her coat. He smiled, kissed my cheek, and said the house looked good. His eyes moved past me toward the living room, then up the stairs, then toward the dining room. It was the kind of glance I had seen from real estate agents. Sophie came in behind them, carrying a canvas bag, and immediately asked whether I still had Thomas's old history atlas. I told her it was probably in the den. She smiled and disappeared toward the shelves. Her ordinary excitement loosened something in my chest. Children can make a room honest simply by wanting what they actually came for. Daniel stood near the fireplace and ran his hand along the mantel. He asked whether I had ever thought about replacing it with something more modern. I said no. Then he asked whether the chimney had been inspected lately, what the roof cost to replace, and whether the property taxes had gone up again. His questions came too smoothly. I answered the first 2 because they seemed harmless. The roof had been replaced 4 years earlier. The chimney was checked every autumn. When he asked about taxes, I looked at him and said, "Why do you ask?" He laughed lightly and told me he was only curious because older homes could become expensive for one person to maintain. Claire was standing by the window when he said it. She rubbed her thumb against her index finger, the same nervous habit she had carried since childhood. I noticed it immediately. She told Daniel that I had managed the house perfectly well. He agreed too quickly, then added that managing something and needing it were different questions. I carried a tray of tea into the living room and set out 4 cups. The steam clouded my glasses for a moment, which gave me an excuse not to answer. Outside, maple leaves scraped across the porch. Sophie came back with the atlas pressed to her chest and asked whether people in old maps ever knew how wrong their borders were. I laughed and Claire did too. Even Daniel smiled. We talked about Sophie's project and whether maps showed truth or only agreement. I remember thinking Thomas would have enjoyed the question. He believed children asked better philosophical questions than most adults because they had not yet learned to hide curiosity behind manners. When Sophie went to photograph a map in the den, Daniel followed me into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter and said the house must feel large now. I told him it felt exactly the right size. He nodded as if I had misunderstood. Then he asked whether my bedroom was still upstairs and whether the stairs bothered my knees. "My knees are fine," I said. He smiled again. "For now," he replied. It was not cruel enough to challenge, but it landed badly. I put the sugar bowl beside his cup and said nothing. Silence often makes people reveal whether they were making conversation or building towards something. Daniel was building towards something. He asked if I had ever looked at smaller homes near Claire and him. There were new townhouses, he said, with first-floor bedrooms and less maintenance. I told him I liked my street, my neighbors, and my garden. He said sentiment made sense, but eventually everyone had to be practical. I heard Thomas in my memory telling me to notice verbs. Claire entered before I could ask what Daniel meant by eventually. She carried a stack of old photographs Sophie had found in the den. One showed Claire at 6 years old with 2 missing front teeth and a paper crown. I held it up, and for a moment my daughter became herself again. She groaned and accused me of keeping evidence. Then Daniel picked up a photograph of the duplex Thomas and I had once owned. He asked whether we still had it. I said I had sold it a few years after Thomas died. He looked surprised. "That must have been a nice payout," he said. Claire looked down at the table. I folded the photograph and placed it beneath another. "It was a fair sale," I said. Daniel asked whether I had invested the proceeds or used them for retirement expenses. His tone remained conversational, but the question was not. I looked directly at him. He reached for his tea and said he only asked because real estate had done well in the area. Claire told him to drop it. He did, at least for several minutes. Sophie asked if we could walk to the back garden before they left. We put on coats and stepped into the cold. The rosemary had survived the first frost, and the last marigolds leaned toward the fence. Sophie clipped one small sprig and held it beneath her nose like perfume. Claire walked beside me while Daniel took a phone call near the porch. I asked whether everything was all right. She said yes, too quickly. I waited. She added that Daniel had been stressed about work and had become obsessed with planning. I asked what kind of planning. She shrugged and said budgets, future expenses, nothing serious. "Is his company all right?" I asked. Claire stopped walking for half a second before continuing. She said construction had been uneven that year, but insisted they were fine. I did not push. She was 41, not 14. A mother can offer a door without dragging an adult child through it. I simply told her I was available. Daniel rejoined us and announced that a supplier had called with a scheduling problem. Claire looked relieved to have the subject changed. Sophie crouched beside the herb bed and found a ladybug moving slowly across a dead basil stem. We all stood around it for several seconds, 4 adults and a child, watching something tiny prepare for winter. Back inside, Daniel noticed the recipe box on the kitchen counter. He opened the lid without asking. I watched his fingers move through Thomas's cards. "You still keep all this?" he asked. I closed the lid gently and said, "Yes." He laughed and said he admired people who could hold on to things that had no practical purpose. Claire heard him and frowned. She told him Thomas had made the box. Daniel raised both hands and said he meant nothing by it. I believed him partly. Careless people do not always understand which objects are load-bearing in another person's life. Still, I moved the box closer to my side of the counter after he stepped away. As they prepared to leave, Daniel paused in the hallway beneath the old family photographs. He asked whether I had updated my estate plan since Thomas died. The question was so direct that even Claire turned toward him. I said yes. He nodded as if checking an item from a list and asked whether Megan Roth still handled everything. I did not remember ever telling him Megan's name. Perhaps Claire had mentioned it. Perhaps Thomas had years ago. Either explanation was possible, yet I felt a small tightening beneath my ribs. I said Megan still represented me. Daniel replied that it was smart to keep documents current, especially when there was only one child involved. Claire told him it was time to go. Her voice had an edge I had not heard all afternoon. Daniel kissed my cheek and thanked me for tea. Sophie hugged me hard and promised to return the atlas the following weekend. I told her to keep it as long as she needed. That was the easiest thing I gave away that day. After their car backed from the driveway, I stood at the front window until the red taillights disappeared beyond the maple trees. The silver anniversary gift was still hidden in the hall closet. I thought about taking it out, then decided against it. Some objects need time before you know whether they are gifts or reminders. I returned to the kitchen and washed 4 cups. The house settled around me with familiar sounds. A pipe clicked behind the wall. The refrigerator hummed. The old clock marked each second. I dried Thomas's recipe box where Daniel had left a damp ring beside it, then placed it carefully back in its usual corner. For the first time, I opened the drawer where I kept my estate papers without needing anything from it. I did not remove the trust statement. I only looked at the neat folders and remembered Daniel asking whether my documents were current. There are questions people ask because they care. There are questions people ask because they are counting. I closed the drawer and turned the small brass key. The gesture felt overly cautious, almost silly. Nobody had threatened me. Nobody had demanded anything. Claire was still my daughter. Daniel was still my son-in-law. And Sophie had left a penciled note thanking me for the atlas. Nothing dramatic had happened in my home. That was exactly what made the afternoon difficult to explain. Boundaries are rarely crossed for the first time with a crash. More often, someone places one foot over the line and waits to see whether you will call it rude. If you do not, they learn something. I was beginning to wonder what Daniel thought he had learned from me. That evening, I made tea and sat in Thomas's old chair near the window. The leaves outside were nearly black against the early sunset. I thought about Claire rubbing her fingers together, Daniel asking about the duplex, and the quick look they exchanged when I mentioned Megan. One question alone meant nothing. Together, they had shape. I still did not know what that shape was. I did not know Daniel's company was carrying more pressure than Claire admitted. I did not know a single piece of paper would soon put a number in front of them. I only knew that Daniel had not spent Saturday admiring my life. He had been inventorying it. Not yet. The following Tuesday, Claire called before lunch and asked whether I still had her original birth certificate. Sophie needed proof of citizenship for a school trip application, and Claire could not find the copy in her files. I told her I kept old family documents in the small desk beside the dining room window. She arrived just after 3, alone this time. I was in the kitchen peeling apples when she came in, and I pointed toward the desk without thinking twice. Claire had opened that drawer dozens of times as a teenager. It held tax folders, warranties, old school records, and things I considered boring enough to be harmless. I heard paper sliding against paper while I worked. Then the sound stopped. It was a tiny pause, maybe 2 seconds, but mothers learn the shape of their children's silence. Claire returned to the kitchen with the birth certificate in one hand. Her expression did not belong to a simple piece of paper. She asked whether I still handled all my finances myself. I told her I did. Then she asked whether Megan helped with investments too. I said Megan handled legal documents, not investments. Claire nodded, looked toward the dining room, and asked whether the trust Thomas and I created was the same one I had mentioned years ago. The question surprised me because I had not mentioned the trust that afternoon. I asked what made her think of it. Claire said she had moved a folder while looking for the certificate and accidentally seen a statement. Her cheeks reddened. She apologized immediately and said she had not meant to pry. I believed that part. I dried my hands and walked with her to the desk. The statement was half covered by a property tax envelope, exactly where I must have left it after reviewing it. Across the top was the trust name. Near the bottom was a market value close to $860,000. It was difficult to miss. Claire said, "Mom, I had no idea." Her voice held surprise more than greed, and I want to be fair about that. She looked almost embarrassed by the number. I told her there was nothing mysterious about it. It was retirement savings, investment growth, and the proceeds from property Thomas and I had sold. She asked whether all of it would eventually go to her. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Eventually is a dangerous word, I said. It depends on what I need while I am alive. Claire lowered her eyes and said, "Of course." Then she folded the birth certificate carefully, as if neat hands could erase the question. We moved back to the kitchen, and I finished slicing apples while she told me about Sophie's trip. For several minutes, everything felt normal again. Cinnamon warmed in a saucepan. Rain ticked softly against the window. Claire even laughed when I reminded her that she had once lost a passport inside a library book. Before she left, however, she asked one more question. She wanted to know who became trustee if I could no longer manage things myself. I told her my documents already covered that possibility. She asked whether she was named. I said, "Some details stay between me and my attorney." Her smile tightened, then returned. That evening, I locked the desk drawer again. I did not do it because Claire had stolen anything. She had not. I did it because privacy, once noticed, becomes something you either protect or quietly surrender. The small brass key turned with a soft, deliberate click. I put it in the blue dish beside my bed. The next morning, Daniel called me before 9. In 7 years of marriage, he had never called me before breakfast, unless Claire was sick or a car had broken down. He said he was checking in and asked how I was feeling. Then, without much distance between subjects, he asked whether I still met with a financial advisor. I told him my finances were handled. He said that was good, then mentioned how easy it was for older people to pay unnecessary fees. His wording was polished, almost protective. He offered to look over statements sometime, free of charge. I thanked him and said, "That will not be necessary." He laughed as if I had made a joke. 2 days later, Claire called again. Then she called Sunday. Then Daniel sent me an article about retirement planning. Their sudden concern arrived with the regularity of weather alerts. I had heard from them more in 1 week than I sometimes did in a month. Attention can feel loving until you notice what changed just before it began. On Sunday afternoon, I took my coffee to the porch and watched wind shake the last yellow leaves from the maple branches. I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps seeing the statement had frightened Claire. Perhaps she had realized I carried more responsibility than she understood. That explanation comforted me for a while. The trouble was Daniel's language. He kept saying, "Keep it in the family." Then came, "Make sure the right people are protected." He never said my money should be theirs. He did not need to. He spoke about my estate like a project awaiting management. Somehow he had already volunteered for the job. The following Thursday, Claire invited me to lunch at a small cafe near her office. She spent the first 15 minutes asking about my sleep, my knees, and whether I had enough help around the house. I answered patiently. Then she stirred her soup without eating and said Daniel thought families should be more transparent about money. I asked what that meant. Claire said emergencies were easier when everyone knew where accounts were and how documents worked. I agreed with the principle. Then I told her transparency did not mean shared authority. She looked hurt and said nobody was trying to take authority from me. I had not accused her of doing so. I let the silence sit between us. Claire finally said Daniel worried I might be carrying too much alone. I asked whether Daniel's worry began before or after she saw the trust statement. Her spoon stopped halfway to the bowl. She said that was unfair. I told her, "It is only a question." She did not answer it. Outside the cafe, rain had stopped and the sidewalk shone under a thin grey sky. Claire hugged me before we separated. She held on a little longer than usual. I almost apologized for making her uncomfortable. Then I remembered how often women are trained to repair tension they did not create. I simply hugged her back. 3 nights later, Sophie called to ask about a history assignment. We talked for 10 minutes about immigration records and old family names. Just before hanging up, she asked whether grown-ups could lose a house because of a business. I asked why she wanted to know. She said Daniel and Claire had been arguing about money after bedtime. I kept my voice calm. I did not ask Sophie to repeat what she had heard. I told her adults sometimes worry about bills, and that none of it was her responsibility. She sounded relieved. We changed the subject to her trip. Afterward, I sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug that had already gone cold. The next day, I called Claire and asked directly whether Daniel's company was in trouble. She exhaled before answering. She said a few projects had been delayed and some clients were slow to pay. I asked whether there was debt. Claire said every business carried debt. It was technically an answer and emotionally an avoidance. I asked whether she was worried. She said Daniel had everything under control. Then she added that he had personally guaranteed a business line of credit, but only because the bank required it. Her voice sped up as she explained, I had heard that rhythm before. Claire talked fastest when she was trying to convince herself. I did not criticize Daniel. I told her business problems could happen to responsible people and asked whether they had spoken with an accountant. She said Daniel hated outsiders getting involved. Then she caught herself and changed the wording. He preferred handling private matters within the family. There was that phrase again. That afternoon, I took Thomas's recipe box from the counter and polished the lid with a soft cloth. The old burn mark remained, as it always had. I found his apple cake card and made the recipe from memory anyway. Measuring flour steadied me. A kitchen can return scale to problems that other people try to enlarge. By then, I understood at least part of the change. Daniel was not suddenly fascinated by estate planning because he had discovered a passion for retirement law. His business was under pressure. Claire had seen a number that looked enormous beside whatever problem they were carrying. From a distance, my savings had begun to resemble a solution. What I still did not know was how serious the problem had become. I did not know about unpaid supplier invoices or the arguments happening after Sophie went to bed. I did not know Daniel had begun thinking about future inheritance as if future meant available. Those facts would come later, one uncomfortable piece at a time. For the moment, I changed only one habit. I stopped leaving financial mail on the dining room desk. Statements went directly into the locked drawer, and anything I no longer needed went through the shredder. It was not secrecy. It was a housekeeping of a different kind. Privacy, like a home, survives through maintenance. That Friday evening, Daniel sent a message asking whether I would consider letting him review the trust with me. He wrote that it would give everyone peace of mind. I read the sentence twice, then placed my phone beside the recipe box. Their concern had discovered a number. Now that number had begun teaching them to ask for access. By the next week, Claire had begun stopping by without asking first. Sometimes she brought soup. Sometimes she said she was in the neighborhood. Once she arrived with Daniel and a measuring tape because he thought one of my upstairs rooms could be rearranged to make things safer. I had not asked for safer. I remembered that clearly. I watched Daniel measure the hallway while Claire opened a closet and talked about storage. They moved quickly, the way people do when they have already discussed a plan elsewhere. I stood near the stairs and finally said, "Please, stop." Daniel lowered the tape and smiled as though I had misunderstood a favor. Neither of them answered. Claire said they were only trying to help. I asked what problem they were helping me solve. She glanced at Daniel before answering. He said the house would eventually be too much for me, and it was sensible to prepare early. I said, "Preparation is not permission." The room became quiet for the first time. Claire looked away. That afternoon, I carried my coffee to the back porch and sat beneath a grey sky. The garden had gone mostly brown, but the rosemary still held its scent. I rubbed one leaf between my fingers and breathed it in. Calm is not the absence of anger. Sometimes calm is what lets anger become useful. I needed that distinction. 2 days later, I came home from the library and found a stack of my mail on the kitchen table. Claire had let herself in with the spare key I had given her years earlier. She said she was helping sort things because I had so much paperwork. A bank envelope had already been opened and placed on top. I noticed that at once. I picked up the envelope and asked whether she had opened it. Claire said she thought it was junk because the logo looked familiar. I told her it was addressed to me. She apologized, but then added that families should not be so secretive about money. That addition mattered more than the apology did. I kept my voice even. I took the spare key from the hook near the refrigerator and placed it in my pocket. Claire noticed immediately. She asked whether I was really going to make a point out of one envelope. I told her, no, I am correcting access. She stared at me as if I had spoken a language she had never heard before. She looked genuinely shocked. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, though Claire claimed she had not called him. He walked into the kitchen already irritated and said I was overreacting. Then he asked why I needed locked drawers if there was nothing to hide. I looked at him and said, "Privacy is not evidence of guilt." He stopped smiling. Claire stared at the floor. The old clock above the stove ticked through several seconds while nobody spoke. I poured myself tea and did not offer any. That small omission surprised me. Hospitality had always been automatic in my house. That day I understood that even kindness can become a habit people use to enter rooms they were not invited into. After they left, I called a locksmith and changed only the back door cylinder. I did not change every lock. I was not ready for that, and I did not want drama. I simply removed the spare key from circulation. The locksmith worked quietly while I stood beside him and listened to the new key turn cleanly. The sound felt final. Claire called that evening and said changing the lock was humiliating. I told her nobody else knew. She said Daniel knew, which proved my point more than hers. Then she accused me of acting as if they were strangers. I said, "Strangers usually ask before opening my mail." She went silent. The line went quiet again. The next Saturday, Sophie came over alone. We baked bread and worked on her school project at the dining room table. She asked why her mother seemed upset with me. I told her adults sometimes disagree about boundaries. Sophie frowned and said, "That sounds like a word people use when they mean rules." I smiled. The answer pleased her. We let the dough rise near the warm stove while rain tapped the windows. Sophie told me about a teacher who never returned essays on time. I listened, grateful for a conversation that wanted nothing from me except attention. After she left, the house smelled of yeast and rosemary, and I remembered what normal care felt like. A week later, Daniel returned with folders under his arm. He said he had printed information about consolidating accounts and adding a trusted family member for emergencies. He laid the papers on my dining room table without asking. I looked at the first page, then pushed the stack back toward him. He seemed offended by the refusal. He said I was being stubborn. Claire told him not to use that word, but she did not tell him to stop. Instead, she asked whether it would really hurt to let her see account information. I told her she could know who to call in an emergency without knowing every balance. She said that sounded unnecessarily formal. Daniel leaned back. Then Claire made a mistake that revealed more than she intended. She said, "We just need to know what we are working with." The word "we" stayed in the room after the rest of the sentence disappeared. I asked who exactly was included in "we." She looked at Daniel. He answered before she could. I waited for her answer. He said Claire was my daughter, so naturally my long-term planning affected their family. I told him my long-term planning affected me first. He laughed once without humor and said everyone knew Claire would inherit eventually. I replied, "Knowing that does not make today belong to you." His face hardened. Claire flinched. I carried their untouched papers to the front hall and placed them on the small table beside Daniel's coat. Then I returned to the kitchen and rinsed my cup. I did not slam anything. I did not raise my voice. The louder they became, the more important it felt to move at the speed of my own decisions. My hands stayed steady. That was when I noticed the recipe box was missing from its usual corner. I asked Claire where it was. She said Daniel had moved it into the pantry because he needed room for the folders. I opened the pantry and found Thomas's box behind a stack of canned tomatoes. one corner pressed against the wall. I felt my chest tighten. When I carried it back, a fresh scrape ran across the lid. Daniel said it was only an old wooden box and offered to buy me a new one. I looked at him for a long moment. "That would not replace this," I said. He shrugged. Claire whispered his name, but the damage had already found its meaning. I did not look away. I ran my thumb over the scrape after they left. It was shallow, but pale wood showed through the darker finish. Thomas had sanded that lid by hand at a rented workbench before Claire was born. I had spent years protecting it from heat and water. Someone else had treated it like clutter in 10 seconds. That mattered to me. The next morning, I made coffee before sunrise and placed the recipe box beside me at the table. I did not feel sentimental. I felt precise. Objects become symbols only when people force them to. Daniel had not merely moved a box. He had shown me what happened to anything he considered inconvenient to his plans. Claire called around noon and asked if we could talk without Daniel. I said yes. She came alone and sat across from me at the kitchen table. For a few minutes, neither of us mentioned money. She apologized for the mail and the recipe box. I thanked her. Then she asked me to make things easier for Daniel. Her apology sounded sincere. I asked what easier meant. Claire said he was under tremendous pressure. Suppliers were demanding payment, and several jobs had stalled. She said he was not sleeping. I felt sympathy for him. Financial fear can make decent people desperate. What sympathy did not do was turn my private life into an emergency fund. I did not dispute the pressure. Claire said she wished I would stop seeing every suggestion as an attack. I told her I did not. Then I listed the suggestions: open my mail, share my balances, add access, consider moving, let Daniel review the trust. She looked down at her hands, spoken in order. The pattern became harder to dismiss. She could hear it now. She rubbed her thumb against her finger until the skin turned pale. Then she said, "He is just stressed. Can you please make this easier?" Hearing the old weakness in my daughter's voice hurt more than Daniel's questions. She was not defending a good idea. She was asking me to absorb his pressure. The sentence exhausted her. I looked at the woman I had raised and remembered the girl who ate lunch alone rather than choose between two arguing friends. Claire still thought peace meant finding the person most willing to bend. For most of her life, that person had been me. I asked, "When does anyone make it easier for me?" She looked up, her eyes filled with tears. For a second, I thought she might answer. Instead, her eyes filled, and she said she never meant to make me feel used. I believed her. Intent and effect are relatives, not twins. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Then I said, "Believing you love me does not require me to ignore what is happening." I meant every word. After Claire left, I opened the windows for a few minutes despite the cold. The kitchen filled with the smell of wet leaves. I wiped the recipe box, but the scrape remained. I decided not to repair it yet. Some marks deserve to stay visible until you understand what they were trying to teach you. I left it exactly as it was. That evening, Daniel sent no message and Claire did not call. The silence felt different from peace, but I did not rush to fill it. I locked the desk, checked the back door, and placed Thomas's recipe box beside the stove. For the first time, I understood that their next request would not be small. I could feel it coming. Claire waited 3 days before asking me to come to her house for dinner. She said Daniel wanted a calm conversation without Sophie nearby. The phrase made me uneasy, but I agreed. I arrived at 6 with nothing in my hands. I had learned that bringing food to tense rooms can make women feel responsible for keeping everyone comfortable. Daniel opened the door wearing a pressed blue shirt, as if we were meeting a banker instead of family. He took my coat and said, "We appreciate you coming." Claire was already at the dining table. In front of her sat a neat stack of papers, 2 glasses of water, and one black pen placed exactly in the center. I stopped beside the chair and looked at the papers before sitting. Daniel said there was nothing alarming there. It was only a family conversation about planning ahead. I had heard that phrase before. People often add the word family when they want a request to sound warmer than the request itself. I sat down slowly. Claire reached for my hand and said she wanted us to talk without arguing. I told her I had not come to argue. Daniel gave a short smile and opened the first folder. The room smelled faintly of roasted chicken from the kitchen, but nobody had served dinner. I understood then that the meal had never been the real invitation. Daniel began by saying that my current trust arrangement was inefficient. He had printed an amendment that would name Claire as a co-trustee while I was still alive. He said it would make bills, investment questions, and emergencies easier. I asked who had prepared it. He said a legal forms service had provided the language. I looked at Claire. She said they had only filled in basic information and that nothing would happen unless I signed. She spoke carefully, watching my face. Daniel added that giving Claire access now would prevent confusion later. He used the word access as though it meant assistance. I noticed he did not use the word control. The papers also included a financial power of attorney form, broader than the one Megan had prepared for me. Daniel said it was standard and would let Claire step in quickly if I became ill. I asked whether Megan had reviewed any of it. He said involving another attorney would only make a simple family decision more expensive. I turned one page and saw language allowing my daughter to request information directly from financial institutions. Another paragraph gave her authority over transactions if certain conditions were met. I was not a lawyer, but I knew enough to recognize that the papers reached farther than Daniel's calm explanation. I closed the folder halfway. Claire said, "Mom, nobody is trying to take anything from you." I replied, "Then nothing should require my signature tonight." Daniel leaned back and exhaled. He said delaying was exactly the kind of problem they were trying to prevent. I looked at him. The more reasonable his voice became, the less reasonable the urgency felt. He moved to the house next. He said the property was too large for one person and could eventually create tax and maintenance problems. Selling in a strong market would free up cash and simplify my life. I told him I had no intention of selling. He answered that intentions should not stand in the way of good planning. Claire tried to soften it. She said nobody expected me to move immediately. They only wanted options. Then she mentioned the new townhouses near her neighborhood again. I asked whether they had discussed where I should live before asking me. Her face changed. Daniel answered for her and said responsible families think several steps ahead. I asked what would happen to the proceeds if I sold. Daniel said the money could remain invested through the trust. Then he mentioned that having Claire involved would make future decisions smoother. The connection was finally plain enough to see. The house, the trust, and the paperwork were not separate topics. They were one plan. For several seconds, I listened to the furnace start beneath the floor. Claire twisted her wedding ring. Daniel turned the black pen so it pointed toward me. I thought of all the meetings I had led as a principal. Whenever someone pushed for an immediate signature, I had taught my staff to ask what changed if they waited one day. Daniel said I was making the situation more complicated than necessary. He reminded me that Claire was my only child and would receive most of the estate eventually. Then he said, "You cannot take it with you." Claire looked down. I felt the sentence settle between us, cold and ordinary. I had heard strangers say kinder things. He kept going. He said they were the people who would be there when I became older, weaker, or unable to handle things myself. He said families plan before a crisis. I agreed with that sentence. Then he added that refusing help because of pride could hurt everyone. Pride was the first accusation disguised as concern. Claire finally looked at me and said she needed to know I trusted her. I told her trust was not measured by access to an account. Her eyes filled. She said I was treating her like Daniel. I understood what she meant, though she could not say it directly. She wanted me to prove my love by separating her from his behavior. Daniel called my response selfish. Not loudly. He almost whispered it. He said Sophie would benefit from a family structure that allowed money to move without unnecessary barriers. I told him Sophie had never asked me for $1. He said children should not have to ask for what grandparents already intend to leave them. That was the moment I saw how far the language had shifted. My money had become future family money. My house had become an asset, waiting for a better use. My signature had become an obstacle. Daniel did not sound like a thief. That would have been easier. He sounded like a man who had convinced himself he was already entitled to plan. Claire pushed the folder towards me and said, "Please just read the first page." I did. Then I read it again. The amendment did not empty the trust or give Daniel a check. It did something more subtle. It moved Claire closer to authority while I was still capable of making every decision myself. That subtlety made it tempting. I loved my daughter. That fact did not disappear because she was frightened or influenced by her husband. I remembered paying her tuition and watching her carry Sophie home from the hospital. I remembered every fever, every scraped knee, every Christmas morning. Love makes terrible arguments persuasive when they arrive in familiar voices. Claire said if I signed, we could stop fighting about money forever. She promised she would never make a decision without asking me first. I wanted to believe her. More than that, I wanted the old ease between us back. For one weak moment, the cost of one signature seemed smaller than the cost of losing my daughter. Daniel slid the pen closer. I picked it up. Claire's shoulders dropped with relief so quickly that I almost missed it. My hand rested above the signature line. I told myself I could always change the documents later. I told myself Claire was still Claire. Those thoughts were comforting because they required nothing difficult from me. I held the pen for several seconds. My thumb pressed against the smooth plastic. Daniel stopped talking. Claire watched my hand instead of my face. That detail hurt. I realized the room was waiting for emotion, not an answer. My signature had become the only version of peace either of them was prepared to accept. Then I noticed Thomas's recipe box on the sideboard behind Claire. I had forgotten she borrowed it to copy his apple cake recipe for Sophie. The lid was still scratched from the day Daniel moved it into my pantry. A white recipe card protruded from one corner, bent slightly beneath the lid. I knew that handwriting. I set the pen down without signing and crossed the room. Claire asked what I was doing. I opened the box and pulled out the card. It was not a recipe. It was an anniversary note Thomas had written decades earlier and tucked among the others. I had forgotten it existed. His square letters filled only 4 short lines. The note said he hoped we would always give because we wanted to, never because somebody made refusal feel cruel. Thomas had written it after we helped a relative through a difficult year. I remembered the conversation now. He had worried that kindness could become obligation when guilt entered the room. I read the card twice. Claire stood behind me and said softly, "Mom, this has nothing to do with Dad." I looked at the scrape across the wooden lid. Daniel said we were wasting time on sentimental objects when we needed to discuss real protection. His words gave the old card more weight than nostalgia ever could. I finally understood what was in front of me. I carried the card back to the table and placed it beside the unsigned amendment. The contrast was almost absurd. One piece of paper reminded me that love needed freedom. The other asked me to prove love by surrendering authority. I sat down again. This time I did not touch the pen. My hands were completely still. Daniel asked whether I was really going to ignore professional planning because of an old note. I looked at him, then at Claire. She was crying quietly, but I no longer confused tears with instruction. I folded Thomas's card once along its old crease and returned it to the box. Then I pushed the entire folder toward Daniel. "No, I said it once. Claire waited for an explanation, and Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but I gave them neither. I stood, picked up my coat, and held the recipe box against my chest. The black pen remained beside the empty signature line. For the first time that evening, the room had nothing left to negotiate. I did not sleep that night. At 4 a.m, I gave up pretending and went downstairs in my robe. The house was completely still. I turned on the small lamp above the stove and made coffee. Then I sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's recipe box beside me, while Daniel's unsigned papers stayed clear in my mind. I expected anger to arrive once I was alone, but it did not. What came instead was something colder and more useful. I began replaying the evening without defending anyone. Daniel had prepared documents. Claire had known they were there. Both had expected my signature that night. Those facts did not require interpretation. I opened a yellow notebook and wrote down what had happened in order. The cancelled dinner, the questions about my house, the trust statement Claire had seen, Daniel's sudden interest in my finances, the opened mail, the spare key, the papers on his dining table. A pattern looks different when it is no longer scattered across memory. For years, I had treated every uncomfortable moment as a separate misunderstanding. That habit had protected my feelings, but it had also protected the behavior. Written on one page, the events no longer looked accidental. They looked like steps. None was dramatic by itself. Together they had been moving steadily toward my signature. I went to the window while the coffee brewed. Beyond the glass, the yard was black and silver with frost. The maple branches moved slightly in the wind. I thought about how many mornings Thomas and I had sat in that kitchen, worrying about bills, school schedules, repairs, and retirement. We had solved those problems ourselves. When I sat down again, I wrote one sentence beneath the list. I did not write that Daniel was evil, or that Claire had stopped loving me. Those conclusions were too easy and too emotional. I wrote, they have begun treating my ability to help as their right to decide. Seeing the sentence on paper made my hands stop shaking. There is a difference between kindness and surrender, but generous people often learn it late. Kindness says, I can help. Surrender says, you may choose what I must give. I had crossed that line so gradually that I had not noticed my own feet moving. Daniel noticed. Claire noticed. They had simply learned to expect the next step. I thought of every time I had answered a financial problem before Claire finished explaining it. A car repair appeared and I offered. A school expense appeared and I offered. A difficult month arrived and I offered. None of those choices had been wrong. What was wrong was allowing repeated rescue to become part of someone else's budget. Thomas had warned me about that without using the word entitlement. He had simply asked whether Claire was requesting help or assuming it. I finally understood why the distinction mattered. Gratitude can survive a gift. Entitlement cannot survive a boundary. One accepts the giver's freedom. The other depends on removing it. I opened the recipe box and found his anniversary card again. I read the 4 lines slowly. The message was not complicated. Give because you want to. Do not let guilt turn generosity into duty. I had known those words for years, yet only now did they feel like instructions. Grief had preserved the card. Pressure had finally explained it. For the first time, I stopped asking how to keep Claire from being upset with me. That question had controlled too many of my decisions. I asked a better one. What would I do if the person asking were not my daughter? The answer came immediately. I would verify everything, protect access, and refuse to sign under pressure. That realization did not make me love Claire less. In a strange way, it allowed me to love her more, honestly. I no longer needed to pretend that protecting her feelings was the same as protecting our relationship. A relationship that survives only when one person keeps surrendering is not peaceful, it is merely quiet. I turned to a fresh page and began listing the support I still provided. I paid the annual premium on a small auto policy Claire had kept from years earlier. I covered Sophie's school technology fee each fall. I paid for a family phone line because combining the accounts had once been cheaper. The list was longer than I expected. There was also a supplemental credit card in Claire's name for emergencies. The limit was modest, and she rarely used it, but the account was mine. I paid for a streaming bundle Sophie liked, a roadside plan on Claire's car, and several small subscriptions I had added over time. Each item seemed harmless until I saw them together. Then I found the transfers. For nearly 3 years, I had been sending a monthly amount towards Sophie's future education account. I did not regret $1 of that. Sophie was not responsible for her parents' choices. Still, I underlined the account because I wanted to know exactly who controlled it and who could reach the money. I added the larger gifts from earlier years on another page: tuition, the townhouse down payment, wedding expenses, repairs, travel. I did not total them because I was not preparing an invoice for motherhood. I only needed to remember the scale of what I had already given before anyone described me as selfish again. By sunrise, the notebook held 2 pages of numbers and 1 page of questions. Which accounts allowed Claire access? Which documents named her for future authority? Could the trust be changed without harming Sophie's future? What would happen if I became ill tomorrow? I wanted facts before I made another emotional decision. I also wrote one rule across the top of the final page: do not punish, protect. That distinction mattered to me. I did not want to erase Claire from my life or use money to frighten her. I wanted every future gift to be deliberate, every legal authority to be appropriate, and every account to reflect the boundaries I actually intended. At 8:30, I called Megan Roth's office. Her assistant said Megan could speak with me at 9:15. I spent the next 45 minutes showering, dressing, and reheating coffee. Routine steadied me. By the time the phone rang, I had my trust binder, the notebook, and a copy of my existing power of attorney on the table. Megan did not react dramatically when I described the previous evening. She asked whether I had signed anything. I said no. She asked whether Daniel had kept copies of my current trust documents. I said not that I knew of. Then she asked me to read the title and first paragraphs of the amendment they had presented. I read slowly. Megan stopped me twice to clarify phrases. She explained that naming Claire as co-trustee could create immediate authority depending on the exact language. It was not the same as simply naming someone to step in after incapacity. Those are different jobs, she said. Different timing, different power. Then we discussed the financial power of attorney. Megan reminded me that I already had a carefully drafted document that activated authority under specific conditions. The form Daniel brought was broader. She did not call it fraudulent. She simply said, "You were right not to sign something you had not independently reviewed." I asked the question that had bothered me most. Could Claire legally be given access without Daniel gaining access too? Megan said legal authority could be structured around Claire alone, but practical control was another matter. If I did not trust the environment around it, she said, I should not create authority merely to prove affection. Her calmness was a relief. She did not tell me to cut anyone off. She did not tell me Daniel was dangerous. She asked what I wanted my estate plan to accomplish. I said I wanted full control while capable. I also wanted protection if I became ill, and something meaningful preserved for Sophie without family leverage. Megan said those goals were ordinary and achievable. She recommended reviewing the successor trustee provisions, my existing power of attorney, account beneficiaries, and the education funds. She also suggested considering an independent fiduciary for certain future roles. The best plan, she said, does not depend on everyone behaving perfectly. I asked whether changing those provisions would be cruel to Claire. Megan was quiet for a moment, then said legal documents were poor places to settle emotional arguments. Do not use the trust to punish her, she said. Use it to express what authority you actually intend. That sentence gave me a way forward that anger had not. We scheduled an in-person meeting for the following week. Before hanging up, Megan told me not to discuss proposed changes until we had reviewed everything. She wanted current statements, deeds, beneficiary forms, and copies of any documents Daniel had shown me. For the first time in days, I had instructions instead of accusations. I spent the rest of the morning gathering files. I made a list of every account, every automatic payment, and every person with authorized access. I did not cancel anything yet. I did not send Claire a warning. A boundary announced too early becomes an argument. I wanted mine to become paperwork before it became conversation. The plan was simple. First, understand what I owned and who could reach it. Second, review every legal role with Megan. Third, separate Sophie's future from Daniel's financial problems. Fourth, remove any access I had granted from habit rather than intention. Only after that would I decide what, if anything, Claire needed to be told. Near noon, I realized the cup beside me was the same coffee I had poured before sunrise. It was completely cold. I drank it anyway. Nothing outside the kitchen had changed yet. Daniel still had his papers. Claire was still angry, but for the first time, I was no longer waiting for them to decide what happened next. I met Megan the following Tuesday at 9 in the morning. I wore a navy coat Thomas once said made me look like I meant business. That memory almost made me smile. I carried one folder and my yellow notebook. The recipe box came in a canvas bag because I no longer wanted it left where anyone else might handle it. Megan's office was quiet, warm, and deliberately plain. No dramatic shelves of law books. No heavy wood table meant to intimidate people. She offered coffee, then asked me to tell her what I wanted before we discussed documents. I said, control while I am capable, protection without punishment, and something safe for Sophie. She wrote those 3 goals at the top of a legal pad. Then she opened my current trust and walked through it page by page. Claire was named as a future successor trustee under conditions Megan had drafted years earlier. That had once seemed natural. Now I understood that family title and financial authority were not the same thing. Megan explained that I could amend a revocable trust while I remained competent, subject to its terms. I asked her to remove Claire from the first successor position. I did not remove Claire as a beneficiary. I did not erase her from my estate. I changed who would hold authority if I could no longer hold it myself. We discussed several alternatives. I could name another relative, but I did not want to move pressure from one branch of the family to another. Megan suggested an independent professional fiduciary as successor trustee. The role would be paid, supervised by the documents, and separate from Daniel's business problems or Claire's emotions. I asked whether choosing a professional meant I no longer trusted my daughter. Megan said, "It means the job no longer depends on the relationship." That answer settled something in me. Claire could remain my daughter without also being the person responsible for deciding how my assets were managed during a crisis. The next issue was my financial power of attorney. Megan compared the existing document with the broad form Daniel had brought to dinner. Mine already named a trusted alternate under carefully defined conditions. We revised the order of agents and removed any ambiguity that might invite pressure before incapacity was properly established. Nothing about the process felt like revenge. That surprised me. Each page required patience, initials, dates, and questions. Legal protection was almost boring in the best possible way. No doors slammed. Nobody was humiliated. A boundary that had felt emotional at Daniel's table became precise once it was translated into paperwork. At Megan's suggestion, I also reviewed every bank and investment account connected to the trust. Some required no change. Others needed updated contact information and new security instructions. I asked that no account discussion be shared with family members unless the documents specifically authorized it. The request fit on a single form. The supplemental credit card in Claire's name came next. I did not cancel it in anger at the office. I asked for the statements first. The balance was small, and the spending was ordinary. Still, the account existed because I had created it years ago for emergencies. I decided that an old emergency tool did not need to become permanent access. I called the issuer from Megan's conference room and removed the additional card holder. The Verizon representative confirmed that Claire's card would stop working once the change processed. I paid the final balance myself because the account was mine. Then I wrote the cancellation date in my notebook and moved to the next item. The family phone plan was less important, but the principle was the same. I transferred Claire's line out of the arrangement and gave her time to establish her own service. I kept Sophie's number untouched until her parents could move it properly. I was not interested in making a teenager wake up to adult consequences. I cancelled the roadside plan attached to Claire's vehicle after confirming when its current coverage ended. I also separated the streaming subscriptions and 2 small automatic payments I had forgotten I was making. None of those amounts would save Daniel's company. That was not the point. I was ending invisible obligations. The education money for Sophie required more thought. I did not want her future exposed to whatever financial strain Daniel was carrying. Megan reviewed the existing account and suggested clearer restrictions. An independent adult could administer it if I died before Sophie reached the appropriate age. We created instructions so money intended for Sophie could be used for education and related needs without becoming a general family account. Claire and Daniel could request qualified expenses through the structure. They could not withdraw the balance for business debt, household shortages, or an emergency they defined themselves. That decision gave me more peace than anything else we did that morning. I had feared that protecting myself would somehow mean abandoning my granddaughter. Instead, careful planning allowed me to separate those 2 ideas. I could close a door against financial pressure without closing a door against Sophie. Megan then returned to the trust itself. Its value had moved slightly since the statement Claire saw, but the figure remained near $860,000. I asked that the amendment preserve Claire's beneficial interest while removing her direct path to control. Megan repeated my instructions back to me before drafting anything. The new structure named an independent fiduciary as successor trustee. It also directed that Sophie's future share be held in a protected subtrust under the terms we selected. Megan explained every clause in ordinary language. When I did not understand a sentence, I asked until I did. Nobody hurried my signature. I thought about Daniel's black pen pointing toward me across his dining table. In Megan's office, 3 pens sat in a cup near the window, and none seemed important. That difference stayed with me. A trustworthy process does not need to make the pen feel urgent. It gives you enough time to understand why you are holding it. We took a break before signing. I carried my coffee to the window and watched people cross the courthouse square below. Coats moved through cold sunlight. A delivery truck stopped at the curb. Life continued without knowing my family had spent weeks arguing over access to money that had taken Thomas and me decades to build. When I returned to the table, Megan placed the amendment in front of me. She summarized the effect one last time. I remained trustee. I remained in control while capable. Claire remained a beneficiary. She would not become the first successor trustee. Sophie's protected share would be administered under the new terms. I signed my name where Megan indicated. The motion took less than 3 seconds. Nothing flashed. Nothing collapsed. Yet the promise behind the title of my own story became real in that quiet room. I had changed the structure governing roughly $860,000 because control and inheritance were not the same gift. Afterward, Megan supervised the related updates and prepared notices for the institutions that required them. She told me which documents should remain private and which changes would later be visible. I asked whether Claire needed immediate notice of the trust amendment. Megan said the answer depended on the document and applicable requirements. I did not use secrecy as a weapon. I followed Megan's instructions and let procedure decide what needed to be communicated. That distinction mattered. I was not trying to create a surprise for Daniel. I was trying to remove his ability to turn every financial decision into a family referendum before I had even made it. Before leaving, I asked Megan to prepare a concise letter for Claire. It would not disclose account balances or invite negotiation. It would state that I had completed an independent estate review and that my documents reflected my current wishes. Future financial requests should come directly to me, not through pressure. Megan drafted the letter while I sat across from her. We removed one sentence that sounded colder than I wanted. We added another, making clear that Sophie's educational support remained protected. The final version was firm without being cruel. I read it twice. Then I signed it beneath a sentence that needed no explanation. The sentence said, "My estate plan is not a family operating account." I had not written it to wound Claire. I wrote it because plain language was becoming necessary. Megan placed the signed letter in an envelope and told me her office would send it by tracked mail. There would be a record, but no performance. On the drive home, I stopped at a small hardware shop and bought a new lock for the desk, where I kept financial records. I did not change every door in the house. Nobody still had a valid spare key. I only replaced the thin old desk lock with something sturdier and moved the trust papers into a fire-resistant box. At home, I put Thomas's recipe box back in its place beside the stove. The scrape on the lid was still visible. I ran my thumb over it once and left it alone. Then I placed the new trust documents in the locked box and turned the key. The click was quieter than Daniel's arguments had been, but far more effective. I made tea and carried it to the back porch, even though the afternoon was cold. The garden had almost nothing left to cut, so I clipped a few rosemary stems and brought them inside. I had not taken my daughter's future away. I had simply stopped handing anyone the keys to mine. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt like peace. The letter from Megan reached Claire on a Thursday afternoon. I knew because she called me at 4:12 and left a message saying we needed to talk immediately. I did not return the call at once. I was at the library shelving donations, and urgency created by someone else was no longer an automatic command. An hour later, Claire called again. This time she said Daniel had read the letter too, and wanted to know what I had changed. I listened to the message twice. Megan's letter had not listed balances or private instructions. It only said my estate review was complete and future financial requests should come directly to me. The first practical consequence appeared the next morning. Claire tried to use the supplemental card at a grocery store and it was declined. She called me from the parking lot, embarrassed and angry. I told her the account had been mine, the balance had been paid, and the additional cardholder access had been closed. She said I should have warned her. I reminded her that the card had been created for emergencies years earlier, not as permanent household income. Claire said she only used it occasionally. I agreed. Then I said, "Occasional access is still access." She went quiet because there was nothing dishonest in that sentence. Daniel took the phone from her. He said cancelling a card without notice was petty and designed to humiliate them. I told him I had not been standing at the register. Nobody there knew why the card failed. He said I was splitting hairs. I said, "No, I am separating consequences from intentions." He ended the call first. I made tea and sat beside the kitchen window while rain darkened the porch boards. My hands were steady. Months earlier, Daniel's anger would have sent me searching for the quickest way to restore peace. Now I understood that his discomfort was not proof I had done something wrong. Sometimes it was only proof access had changed. That afternoon, Claire drove to my house without calling. She tried the old back door key before walking around to the front. I heard the key scrape against the new cylinder. When I opened the front door, she stood there holding it in her palm. "You really changed it," she said. I answered, "Yes, weeks ago." She asked whether I was afraid of her. I said no. Then she asked why her key no longer worked. I told her the answer had nothing to do with fear. A key is permission, I said. I had stopped meaning the permission it represented. Claire looked at the brass key as if it had betrayed her instead of simply becoming obsolete. I invited her to sit on the porch because Daniel was waiting in the car. Claire refused at first, then changed her mind. The cold made both of us pull our coats tighter. For several minutes, we watched cars move along the wet street. I was grateful for the weather. It gave us something neutral to look at. Claire finally asked whether I had removed her from the trust. I told her I would not discuss every provision, but I had not erased her as my daughter or beneficiary out of anger. I had changed authority. She stared at me. "So you don't trust me," she said. I answered, "I do not trust pressure with power." Daniel got out of the car before she could respond. He came up the walk quickly, carrying Megan's letter folded in his hand. He said independent fiduciaries charged fees and complicated families. I told him fees were sometimes the price of neutrality. He said neutrality was unnecessary when blood relatives were available. I did not answer. He asked how much of the trust would now be controlled by strangers. I corrected the question. While I was capable, the trust was controlled by me. That fact seemed to frustrate him more than anything else I said. His face changed for just a second, and I saw what had been hiding beneath weeks of concern. He needed access soon. I asked Daniel how much his company owed. Claire turned toward him so sharply that the question answered part of itself. Daniel said business debt was private. I nodded. Then, my trust is private too. He told me the situations were different. I asked him to explain why. For the first time, his prepared language disappeared. Claire whispered that she thought the company was only behind on a few projects. Daniel said that was true, technically. Then I asked whether supplier invoices were unpaid. He looked at me and asked who had told me. I said nobody had. Financial pressure leaves fingerprints, even when people refuse to show you the bill. The porch went quiet except for water dripping from the gutter. Claire asked Daniel again how much they owed. He said the number moved every week. She asked whether he had personally guaranteed the business line of credit. He admitted he had. Then she asked whether there were other obligations she did not know about. He stood and paced to the porch rail. The company owed suppliers, a short-term equipment lender, and part of a tax payment plan. None of those facts made him a criminal. Businesses fail every day without anyone being wicked. What mattered was that Claire had not known the full picture while he was planning around my money. I asked whether he had ever told a lender that family money might become available. Daniel said he had only described possible support if business conditions worsened. Claire stared at him. He added that no trust had been pledged and no legal promise existed. That distinction was important, but it did not repair the deception. Claire asked what possible support meant. Daniel said he had assumed she would eventually inherit and that I had always helped when family needed something. The sentence was almost gentle. That made it worse. He had not imagined stealing from me. He had imagined my refusal disappearing before he ever needed to hear it. I watched Claire absorb that. Her anger changed direction slowly, like a weather front. She asked whether the dinner papers had been connected to the business problems. Daniel said they were about planning. Claire asked the question again. This time he admitted that earlier access would have made several options easier. She asked what options. Daniel mentioned a temporary family loan, a personal guarantee backed by stronger household finances, and the possibility of asking me to invest in a project. I told him none of those things had been discussed with me. He said he was preparing possibilities. I replied, "You were preparing my answer for me." Daniel said I was making him sound manipulative. I told him I was describing sequence. He learned the trust value. His questions increased. He pushed for access. He prepared papers. His company needed liquidity. Facts did not become insults simply because they were uncomfortable when spoken in order. He raised his voice then, not enough to frighten me, but enough that Claire flinched. He said I was destroying the family over money. I looked at him and said, "Money did not create this problem." He asked, "What had?" I answered, "Permission you gave yourself." The porch became quiet again. Claire began to cry. I did not comfort her immediately. That was difficult. Every instinct in me wanted to move beside her and soften the moment. Instead, I let my daughter experience the truth without rescuing her from it. Love sometimes means refusing to interrupt the lesson another adult finally has enough information to learn. Claire asked whether I would help if the company collapsed. I told her I would help Sophie remain safe, fed, educated, and loved. I would not write Daniel a business check to prevent consequences from reaching him. Claire wiped her face and nodded once. It was the first answer that day she did not try to negotiate. Daniel asked whether I understood what bankruptcy could do to them. I said I understood fear very well. Thomas and I had survived layoffs, medical bills, and years when one repair could ruin a month. Then I said, "Fear explains pressure. It does not authorize it." He looked away toward the wet maple leaves. He tried one last argument. He said the trust would belong to Claire someday anyway. I shook my head. "That is the sentence you keep building everything on," I said. "Someday is not an account number." Claire closed her eyes. Daniel did not answer. For once, the future had stopped behaving like money he could spend. I turned to Claire and said the hardest thing I had said to her since she was a child. "You did not lose my money, Claire. You lost the right to plan with it." She stared at me for several seconds, then looked down at the key still in her hand. I did not ask for the key back. It no longer opened anything. Claire stood first. She told Daniel she wanted to go home and see every business statement, loan document, and unpaid invoice. He began explaining before they reached the car. She stopped him. "Not in pieces this time," she said. I heard a strength in her voice that I had waited years to hear, clearly. After they drove away, I locked the front door and stood in the hallway, listening to the new silence. I felt no triumph. Daniel still had a frightened business to face, and Claire had a marriage full of questions. I had not fixed either problem. I had only stopped allowing my savings to hide them. Still. I went to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and placed Thomas's recipe box beside the stove. Rain tapped lightly against the glass. When the water boiled, I made tea and sat alone at the table. The house felt like mine again, not because anyone had lost something, but because I had stopped confusing love with access. 4 months passed before Claire came to my house alone. By then winter had settled over Pennsylvania, and the maple trees stood bare against a pale sky. The first snow had melted into dark lines along the curb. I had stopped measuring my days by phone calls from Daniel. Silence had become ordinary again. Life after a boundary is quieter than people imagine. There was no dramatic victory, no morning when I woke, feeling that everything had been repaired. I went to the library, bought groceries, paid bills, and made soup on Sundays. The calm returned in small pieces, which may be the only way real calm ever returns. Megan sent me updated copies of the trust documents in January. I placed them in the fire-resistant box and wrote the date in my notebook. The account values still moved with the market. I no longer watched the number as if it were the center of the problem. Authority had been the real issue all along. I kept Thomas's recipe box beside the stove. The scrape across the lid remained visible through Christmas and into the new year. I could have repaired it sooner, but I was not ready. Some damage needs to be understood before it is polished away. By February, I could touch the mark without remembering Daniel's hand. Daniel's company did not collapse, though it came close enough to frighten him. He sold one piece of equipment, reduced his crew, and negotiated payment schedules with suppliers. A project he had counted on was cancelled. Another finally paid late invoices. None of it was easy. but none of it required a check from me. Claire moved the household budget onto her own laptop and began reviewing every bill herself. She later told me she had not known how many obligations Daniel had stacked on top of one another. Their marriage did not suddenly improve. They argued, slept in separate rooms for a while, and eventually started counseling. I learned those details slowly because I stopped asking questions designed to rescue them. Claire told me what she wanted me to know. I listened without offering money. At first, that restraint felt unnatural. Then it became a form of respect. Her marriage and Daniel's business were adult problems belonging to adults. They cancelled a planned vacation, sold Daniel's newer truck, and began cooking at home more often. Claire picked up extra consulting work in the evenings. I felt no satisfaction hearing any of that. Cutting expenses is not humiliation. Thomas and I had done the same thing during difficult years. Responsibility is rarely glamorous. Daniel never called to apologize during those months. I did not demand that he do so. An apology requested, like a debt, usually becomes another transaction. I preferred distance to performance. Megan's letter remained the final direct communication between us, and that was enough while everyone learned how to live without assumed access. The supplemental card stayed closed. Claire established her own phone plan. The automatic payments I once covered disappeared from my statements one by one. The amounts were small, but the emotional effect was not. Each month my accounts reflected only obligations I had chosen. My financial life became quiet in a way I had forgotten. I kept Sophie's support separate from all of it. Her education funds remained protected under the new plan, and I continued paying agreed school expenses directly when I wanted to. Claire never used Sophie to ask for more. I was grateful for that. A child's future should not become collateral in an argument between adults. Sophie still came most Saturdays. She brought homework, music I did not understand, and an appetite that made me wonder whether teenagers had hollow legs. We baked bread and worked puzzles at the dining room table. She never asked what was in my trust. She cared whether I had cinnamon rolls. That difference made me smile. One afternoon, Sophie noticed the scrape on Thomas's recipe box. I told her the finish had been damaged and that I planned to repair it when the weather warmed. She asked if she could help. Thomas had once taught Claire to sandwood in the garage. The thought of teaching Sophie felt like a thread continuing forward. I never told her Daniel had caused the scrape. That information would have served no purpose except recruiting a child into an adult grievance. Instead, I told her the box had been in our family longer than her mother had been alive. Sophie ran her fingers over the lid and said, "Then we should make it last." By March, the first crocuses appeared along the side of the house. I saw Sophie after school one Friday and noticed she seemed lighter. She said her parents were arguing less. I told her I was glad. Then we talked about her upcoming trip. Children deserve conversations that do not require them to carry family history. Claire arrived the following Sunday just before noon. She came alone, parked at the curb, and sat in her car for almost a minute before walking up the path. I watched from the kitchen, but did not go to the door until she knocked. The old key was gone from her ring. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. She wore the green coat I had given her 2 Christmases earlier. Her eyes looked tired, but her hands were still. She did not ask to come inside. Instead, she said, "Could we talk for a few minutes?" I opened the porch door and pointed to the 2 chairs. "We can have coffee out here," I said. She nodded. I brought 2 mugs and a folded blanket for her knees. The air was cold enough to show our breath. Claire wrapped both hands around the coffee and stared toward the bare maple tree. For several minutes, she said nothing. I did not rescue the silence. People sometimes need room to choose honest words instead of easy ones. Finally, she said, "I was wrong." There was no explanation attached to it. No mention of stress, Daniel, debt, or misunderstanding. She said she had allowed her fear of conflict to become agreement. She had let Daniel speak for both of them, because opposing him felt harder than disappointing me. Then she looked directly at me. She apologized for the papers, the mail, and the questions. She also apologized for speaking about my home as if it were waiting for another owner. Then her voice broke. She mentioned the dinner and said she had heard herself say just family, yet still said it. I looked down at my coffee. That was the apology I had needed most. I told her the sentence had hurt me. I did not tell her it was fine, because it had not been fine. Claire nodded and said she understood. Then she told me she had spent months realizing how often she asked the more flexible person to bend. You were always the easier person to ask, she said. That was true. She did not ask about the trust until I mentioned it. I told her the documents would remain as Megan and I had arranged them. Claire swallowed, then said, I know. She did not ask me to reconsider. That restraint mattered more than any promise she could have made. An apology changes when it stops trying to recover a benefit. I reached across the small table and covered her hand with mine. You are my daughter, Claire, I said, but being my daughter does not make my choices yours. She nodded through tears. Then she squeezed my fingers once. There was sadness between us, but no negotiation. For the first time, sadness felt clean. The following Saturday, Sophie came with fine sandpaper and a small tin of finish from the hardware store. We carried Thomas's recipe box to the garage and worked slowly on the scratched corner. I showed her how to follow the grain. She concentrated with her tongue against her cheek, exactly as Claire had done at 14. We did not erase every mark. The deepest line remained faintly visible after the new finish dried. I liked it that way. The box looked cared for rather than new. Thomas had never believed useful things needed to stay perfect. He believed they needed maintenance, patience, and hands willing to repair what could still be repaired. When we returned the box to the kitchen, Sophie placed Thomas's anniversary card near the front instead of hiding it among recipes. I read the old sentence again about giving freely. This time it did not feel like a warning. It felt complete. A lesson becomes peace when you no longer need the pain that taught it. Spring came slowly. I sat on the porch with black coffee and watched green return to the maple branches. I had learned that a boundary can disappoint someone and still be loving. I had learned that generosity needs freedom, or it becomes obligation. And I had learned that forgiveness does not require restored access. I still loved Claire. I hoped Daniel's business recovered honestly. I wanted their marriage to become healthier, not merely quieter. None of those hopes required me to undo a single document. Love can wish someone well without reopening every door. That was the kind of love I finally knew how to offer without disappearing inside it. If you have stayed with me this far, tell me what you think. Would you have changed the trust? Or would you have given Claire another chance with control? And if someone you love has ever confused your kindness with permission, you may share that too. Your story might help another person name a boundary they have been afraid to draw. That evening, I put Thomas's recipe box back beside the stove and closed the kitchen window against the cool spring air. Claire was still my daughter. Sophie was still my joy. My home was still mine. I had forgiven without surrendering. And for the first time in a very long while, nothing inside me needed to argue with that. What happened between Eleanor, Claire, and Daniel was never really about $860,000. The money only exposed a problem that had been growing quietly for years. Eleanor had helped with tuition, a down payment, repairs, phone bills, and emergencies because she loved her daughter. The danger began when repeated generosity stopped feeling like a gift and started feeling like available family property. A boundary was not cruelty in that moment. It was the sentence that restored ownership to the person who had earned the right to choose. Eleanor also learned that generosity has meaning only when refusal remains possible. Daniel's business debt did not make him evil, and Claire's fear of conflict did not erase her love for her mother. But fear and pressure do not create entitlement. When Eleanor refused the amendment, reviewed her accounts, changed the successor trustee and protected Sophie's future through a separate structure, she did not punish her family. She made sure help would remain help instead of becoming a system other people could operate without her consent. The final lesson came on the porch months later. Claire returned alone, apologized without asking for money, and accepted that the trust would remain changed. Eleanor forgave her, held her hand, and still kept the boundary. That is an important distinction. Forgiveness can release bitterness without restoring authority. Reconciliation can begin without pretending nothing happened. Even Thomas's scratched recipe box was repaired, not replaced, and one faint mark remained. Some relationships heal the same way. They become usable, warm, and meaningful again without becoming exactly what they were before. You can love someone, wish them well, and still keep the keys to your own life. A loving boundary does not close the heart. It simply stops love from becoming a blank check.